Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. Hi everyone. Welcome again with Dr. Marwan, TBYP, tips to boost your knowledge in pharmacology for medical students and other students of medical background. Today's tip is about drug antagonists and their classification. So this is the tip number 10. And we start with the definition of an antagonist. The general definition of an antagonist is that it is any drug that's capable of reversing the action of the agonist. The agonist is the receptor stimulant. So the major classification of the antagonist is first the pharmacological antagonist, and second is the non-pharmacological antagonist. The definition of the pharmacological antagonist is that antagonist that can reverse the action of the agonist by binding to the same receptor. The key word here is the same receptor of that of the antagonist. While for the non-pharmacological antagonist is that antagonist that reverses the action of the agonist by binding to other than the same binding sites of that of the original agonist. So we for the pharmacological antagonist further subdivided into competitive, which is reversible, or sometimes it's called surmountable antagonist. And the second is non-competitive, irreversible, unsurmountable antagonist. The competitive antagonist is characterized by by binding to the active binding site of the receptor of the agonist weakly binding to the active binding site. And if we look at this illustration, we can see that this is an active binding site and this is a different binding site, all lying on the same receptor, on the cell membrane receptor. Here, the agonist competes with the antagonist for the same acting binding site, and the competitive antagonist binds weakly to that active binding site, which means it's a surmountable, reversible antagonism in which if we increase the concentration or the dose of the agonist, we will be capable to detach the competitive antagonist and come back with the original action of the agonist. So this is what makes it competitive reversible. This is the majority of the drugs actually, which acts as a reversible competitive antagonist. Non-competitive irreversible antagonist is further subdivided into covalent inhibitor and allosteric inhibitor. So the covalent inhibitor, in contrast to the competitive reversible antagonist, it binds covalently strongly with covalent bond to the active binding site. As we can see he's in the illustration here below, that we can see that the non-competitive irreversible antagonist, after attaching to the receptor, it binds with a covalent bond. So this covalent bond makes it undetachable. No matter how much we increase the dose or the concentration of the agonist, it will not be possible to reverse the action. That's why it's irreversible covalent inhibitor and type of antagonist. For the allosteric, it is another type of irreversible antagonist in which the antagonist binds to a distant binding site on the same receptor. So we are still on the same receptor site, but not the active binding site of the receptor, in which for which the agonist binds in a three-dimensional conformational fitting. By binding of the antagonist to this allosteric binding site, it creates a conformational change, three-dimensional conformational change in the shape of the active binding site of the receptor, which makes it unrecognizable for the agonist to bind with, and therefore its access is denied. And this is the second type of irreversible non-competitive antagonist, in addition to the covalent inhibitor. For a non-pharmacological antagonist, yeah, those antagonists are subdivided into chemical antagonists and physiological functional antagonists. The key in both is that they don't bind to the same receptor of that of the agonist. So in chemical antagonism, we have the example of heparin, which is negatively charged. In cases of overdose or toxicity with heparin can cause bleeding. So in order to avoid this bleeding, counteract this bleeding, prevent this bleeding, we use antidote, which is positively charged, binds with histamine. This is protamine, positively charged antidote chemical substance. So this is simple chemical binding. It antagonizes the action of the first drug, not by binding to the same receptor of heparin. So this is the non-pharmacological type 1 of antagonism or subtype. The second subtype of non-pharmacological antagonist is the physiological antagonist, uh, which also does not bind to the same receptor of that of the agonist, but it reverses the action of the agonist by stimulating another receptor which with an opposite function. In other words, the physiological antagonist is another agonist, that binds to a different receptor than that of the agonist. But this receptor, when stimulated, it has opposite action to the stimulation that can happen by the agonist. So if we consider acetylcholine here, this is a cardiomyocyte, striated muscle cell of the heart. And this is the acetylcholine that is released from the vagus nerve, the parasympathetic nerve that reaches the heart. This is a terminal nerve ending, and then acetylcholine stimulates muscarinic M2 receptors to cause negative chronotropic effect, reduce heart rate, reduce cardiac contractility, and reduce cardiac conduction velocity. So everything is reduced: contractility, heart rate, and conduction velocity. Now, if we reverse these actions, it is possible to reverse it by the use of another stimulant, another agonist. So when we use noradrenaline or norepinephrine, it will bind to beta-1 receptor, causing the reverse of the actions of the acetylcholine on the cardiomyocytes. So noradrenaline will increase the cardiac contractility, will increase the conduction velocity, and will increase the heart rate. So with this, it reverses the action of the agonist, the first agonist, by stimulating another different receptor to that of the agonist. So with that, this is the physiological. These are the types and the classification of antagonists. I hope we have learned about the definition and the types. Thank you so much. This is the end of tip number 10. See you again with another tips to boost your knowledge in pharmacology with Dr. Marwan. Assalamu alaikum.